Every single year, every analyst tries to predict how many wins every single NFL team will have. So today, I thought I would do the same by making a tier list video on how many wins each NFL team will get. Let's get started. So as you guys can see, we have a tier list created with 6 different tiers, starting off with 14 to 17 wins, and 12 and 13, 9 and 11, 7 and 8, 4 and 6, and 1 and 3. We're going to be doing these in alphabetical order, so if you do want to just skip to your favorite team, you can do so. Starting off with the San Francisco 49ers, I do think they're going to be one of the best teams in the NFL, and I also don't think they're going to be particularly bad in comparison to what their offseason has sort of looked like. I think they're going to be a very good team. That being said, I don't think they'll quite hit that 14 to 17 game mark. In fact, I don't think there's a single team that I will have in the 14 to 17 mark. If there is, it's probably going to be a team like the Chiefs or maybe the Lions, but probably nobody. I think the majority of the really good teams will be in this 12 to 13 category. Next up, we have the Arizona Cardinals, and I'm going to put them in the 4 to 6 win category. I do think they're going to take a pretty sizable step forward. I really like Marvin Harrison Jr. I really like Kyler Murray. I think the offensive line is getting better as well as the defense, and I like the coaching staff for the most part. With that being said, this is a roster that does need a little bit more time to continue to develop. I think it's an okay thing for this team to be a 4 and 6 team so that they can get another top 10 pick in next year's draft and continue to rebuild and continue to build up this roster so that next year it's a really complete team overall. Next up, we have the Baltimore Ravens, and I'm also going to be putting them in the 12 to 13 win mark, kind of similar to the San Francisco 49ers. They did maybe take a step back from last year's roster, but I still feel like the roster in general is still really solid. They kept the majority of the guys. They brought in Derrick Henry. This is a team that should be taking a pretty sizable step forward, hopefully into the playoffs, and hopefully they can actually make the Super Bowl this year. We'll have to wait and see. I still think that they are probably the 2nd or 3rd best team in the AFC. Next up, we have the Buffalo Bills, and I'm going to predict them to probably win about 9 to 11 games. I'm predicting probably more like 11 games though. Unfortunately, there's not like an 11 to 12 tier list in this section, which is probably where I'd put the Buffalo Bills, but I don't think they're quite good enough in comparison to the Niners and the Ravens roster-wise, even though I believe in Josh Allen just as much as I do Lamar and Purdy. I think the roster took a bit of a small step back, but I do think they're going in the right direction as a franchise, so I decided to put the Buffalo Bills in the 9 to 11 win mark. Next up, we have the Carolina Panthers, and similar to the Arizona Cardinals, I'm going to put them in this 4 to 6 win mark. I think they're going to take some small steps forward next year. I think Bryce Young will look better. I like the additions of Jonathan Brooks, Jatavion Sanders, Xavier Legette, some of the offensive line additions, and the defense is still pretty solid. With that all being said though, this is a roster that needs to build chemistry, and I think the beginning of the season might look a little ugly as they're kind of working out the kinks of the offense and some of the defensive positions with certain players leaving this offseason. But I think as the season goes along, the team will get more comfortable, and they'll maybe end the season on like a 4 wins and 4 losses. So I think they'll probably lose a lot of games early on, maybe win a couple. And I think as the season progresses, they'll start to win more games because of the chemistry building and just overall getting the kinks out of this offense. Next up, we have the Chicago Bears, and I'm going to give them that 9 to 11 win mark. Similar to Buffalo, I think they're a really good team that can compete with any team in the NFC. My only question marks for Chicago is that they have a rookie quarterback and a rookie wide receiver in Rome Odunze to go along with a lot of younger pieces just in general. That being said, I do have a lot of faith in Caleb Williams as a prospect and as a player, so I'm going to predict them to win somewhere between 9 to 11 games next year. I think it's more likely than anything that they'll probably win about 10 games, which is probably what I'm going to predict when the season is about to start and I get to my full official predictions. But for now, I think the Chicago Bears are somewhere between that 9 to 11 win mark. Next up, we have the Cincinnati Bengals, and I'm also going to be putting them in that 9 to 11 win mark. A lot of really good teams early on in this video. The Cincinnati Bengals have a lot of really good things going for them. Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins. We'll see if some of those guys get paid because Jamar and T, I don't believe have gotten paid yet. Hopefully they will soon. That's a really good team all around though. I mean, defensively, they're pretty good. Offensively, they've gotten a lot better on the offensive line. And I just believe that if this team is able to stay healthy, this is one of the best and top contending teams within the AFC. The AFC North is going to be stacked next year with the Ravens, the Steelers, the Browns, and Bengals. And I do think the Bengals are going to have a hard time competing with those teams consistently throughout the year. But I do think that they will win a lot of games next year and probably make a deep playoff push. Next up, we have the Cleveland Browns, and yet again, I'm going to stick with this 9 to 11 win mark. I think it's more likely that they'll probably hit that 10 to 9 win mark, which is still pretty solid. I don't know if they're going to make the playoffs next year, but I think they have a good chance of it. Roster-wise, it's one of the best rosters in the NFL. I just don't know how much I personally believe in Deshaun Watson as a prospect and as a quarterback at this current stage in his career. He feels like he's kind of just been on the decline ever since he's been in Cleveland. Last year was a pretty solid year when he was playing, but can we trust his health and can we trust his play? As of today, I don't really have the answer to that, but I do think that this is going to be a team that will be competitive with a lot of other teams out there. Next up, we have the Dallas Cowboys, and I know you guys see me wearing a Cowboys hat. That does not mean I'm going to have the Cowboys winning 14 to 17 games. Trust me, the Cowboys are a little bit of a mess right now. They're a little bit top-heavy in terms of their roster talent. Like, they have some pretty good starters, but their depth is really lacking. So I can really see this team wearing down as the season goes along. Like, one big injury to the Dallas Cowboys kind of tanks their season, and it's not just at the quarterback position, but if CeeDee Lamb goes down, God forbid, that's a big loss for this offense. If Brandon Cooks goes down, they don't really have a second receiving weapon. If Micah Parsons goes down, they don't really have a dominant pass rusher. And I know that a lot of teams have those same issues, but really for Dallas, their depth is going to be really tested this year. I'm also just going to put them in that 9 to 11 win mark. Past couple years, they've been able to get that 12 and 13. I think they've made a 13 win at one point, but they've been able to consistently get to that mark. But I don't think they're going to be that good this year. Pretty brutal schedule early on. They have the Bengals later in the season, as well as the Eagles twice. I think it's a pretty tough schedule for Dallas to get to that 12 to 13 win mark, but I do think that they will be a pretty solid regular season team. Will they make a deep playoff run? Probably not. Next up, the Denver Broncos. They're going to be in that 1 to 3 win mark. They might be the only team in that mark, but I could also see maybe another team entering into that mark later in the video. I think Denver's a decent roster. Unfortunately, the rest of the NFL just is so much more superior than the Denver Broncos. And if Bo Nix does not come out in his rookie year and just plays out of this world, I don't really see a path for Denver to really get 7 to 8 or 4 to 6 wins next year. I think there's a more realistic chance that this team goes 0 and 17 than it is for them to go 4 and 13. That's how good I think the rest of the NFL is. I haven't looked exactly at every single one of their schedules, so if their schedule's a little bit easier, then maybe they could get to that 4 win mark. But as of today, where I'm sitting at right now, until I go through that schedule, I'm thinking 1 to 3 wins at most. Next up, we have the Detroit Lions, and I will also be putting them in that 12 to 13 win mark. Again, it's really difficult for me to predict a 14 and 17 win mark for any of these teams just because of how good the NFL is, how good every single team is. So to me, if you get to that 12 to 13 win mark, you're one of the best teams in the NFL, and I do think the Detroit Lions are maybe the best team in the NFC, or maybe the second best team in the NFC. I've talked about them at pretty good lengths throughout the past couple videos. I'm a big fan of Jared Goff. I think he's going to have a big year this year with all of the really good pieces around him, the offensive line, the receivers, Jahmyr Gibbs, solid defense. They improved the secondary a ton, which is one of my only big concerns for this roster, and I do think that Terrion Arnold and Ennis Rankeshaw will fix a lot of those bigger issues. I like where the Detroit Lions are heading. I think they'll be maybe in the Super Bowl next year, for all we know. Next up, we have the Philadelphia Eagles, and if you checked out my last video, I talked about which teams are in that like contending power rankings type of video. It was a pretty fun video. I had the Philadelphia Eagles as a B tier team, but I said specifically in that video that I thought they were going to be a phenomenal regular season team. So with that being said, I will have them in that 12 to 13 win mark. I actually would not be surprised if Philadelphia got to that 14 win mark because of how stacked this roster is. What I said in that video still applies to this video. I think they're going to be a fantastic regular season team, but I do have some question marks about how they're going to perform when it gets down to it come the postseason with Kellen Moore. I'm not a big believer in Kellen Moore. If you watch that video, which I'll have pinned up at the end of this video, you'll know I talked about how poorly Kellen Moore has performed in the postseason. That still stands here today. I do think he's a good offensive coordinator who can get this team to about 13 or 14 wins next year. I would not be surprised if at the end of this year, they're in this mark because of how loaded the talent is on this roster. Pretty tough schedule. It's not one of the easier ones, but still, they're a fantastic team. Hopefully, Jalen Hurts can play like an MVP quarterback, because if he can, maybe we're talking about the Super Bowl favorites next year. Next up, we have the Atlanta Falcons, and I will also be putting them in that 9 to 11 win mark. I think it's very realistic that the Atlanta Falcons win the NFC South and play unbelievably well throughout the season. I think they're one of the top contending teams in the NFC. That being said, are they my top contending team? Not my top one, but they're definitely in the conversation. I like Kirk Cousins if he can come back and play like the Kirk Cousins that we saw last year, which, by the way, I want to mention, I know the Vikings weren't winning a lot of games last year, but Kirk Cousins was statistically playing like an MVP up until the point of his injury. Would he have won the MVP? Probably not, but he was playing freaking awesome football. Go back and watch the highlights if you have not seen what he was able to do back then. But now he's playing for the Atlanta Falcons, which have a lot more talent, a lot more continuity, and a lot of things going for them. I like Raheem Morris. I like their offensive coordinator. I think they're going to be a good team next year. Might take a little bit for them to burn off some of the kinks because of the new offensive system, the Kirk Cousins injuries. So I think once they burn off some rust and burn off some of the, the kinks in the offense, I think they could be a really good team down the stretch and probably playing and peaking at the right time. Next up, we have the Green Bay Packers, and I'm kind of conflicted here. I want to put them probably in the 12 win mark, so I'll have them just slightly above the 9-11 win mark. I'm a big fan and a big believer of Jordan Love. I think that's going to be a really good team. Only question for me is that they're in a really tough NFC North, which has a lot of really good teams. Can they go to 12 to 13 wins with that division? I don't know. But I personally do believe that if the Packers are going to make a deep playoff run, I think this is arguably their best chance in quite some time. I believe in Jordan Love. I believe in a lot of the offensive and defensive players. I believe in the coaching staff. I think they're going to be a top contending team next year. I think it's pretty realistic that they'll get to like 12 wins next year. On those same lines, a lot of those same exact principles could be said for the Houston Texans. A lot of these teams that we talked about early on have been really good. I think as we go along the board here, I'm starting to see a couple teams that are going to be a little bit lower on this list. Right now, we have 12 teams with 9 or more wins. I think it will even out as we go along the list here. But the Houston Texans are a freaking awesome team. The same principles that I said about the Packers can be said about the Texans. I like their offense. I like their defense. I love CJ Stroud. I like their coaching staff. Their schedule is not the hardest in the world. They're in a pretty tough division, but I don't think that it's tough enough for this team to lose more than 5 or 6 games next year. Next up, the Indianapolis Colts. I've been very high on them the entire season. I think they'll probably hit that 10-win mark. I love Anthony Richardson. I love Shane Steichen. I think they will probably be a playoff team next year, more than likely in the wild card, but I think there's a good chance they actually beat the Texans for the division next year. I say good chance, probably like a 60-40 split right now between those two teams. 60, of course, going to Houston, 40, of course, going to Indianapolis. But I personally do believe that this Indianapolis Colts team has a lot of things going for them. They have a really solid receiving core, great offensive line, great running back. My question really just comes down to, can Anthony Richardson step up to the mantle that we have expectations-wise? And if he can, that's a really solid team. Next up, we have the Jacksonville Jaguars, and they're going to be my first team to enter into that 7-8 win mark. Now, I like this Jaguars roster, but after going through their schedule, it's a pretty tough schedule. They're one of the few teams that I've actually looked at every single one of their games that they have next year, and I had a really hard time picking a lot of their wins because of how tough the schedule is next year for them. Not saying it's the hardest in the world, but a lot of those even matchups, I think, are going to go against the favor of the Jaguars, but I do think they're still going to be good enough to get to about 8 wins next year. They're a good team. I believe in Trevor Lawrence. I believe in Doug Peterson, but I just don't know quite yet if they're up to the level of the Colts or the Texans or a lot of the other AFC teams. With that all being said, though, if Trevor Lawrence can play like an MVP level quarterback, then obviously the story completely changes. But until I personally see Trevor Lawrence play at that level, I can't really talk about him being a 10 to 11 win team until I see Trevor Lawrence be an MVP. Next up is Kansas City. I'm going to put them in the 14 to 17 win mark. I don't think they will get to that mark, but I do think that they're clearly the best team in the NFL, barring any big time drastic regression from Travis Kelce, which is pretty realistic at this stage in his career. I don't think this team is going to struggle offensively, even if he does regress. Barring a big regression from him, then maybe they could lose a handful of games more. But they brought in Hollywood Brown, they got Rashee Rice, they got Xavier Worthy, kind of 3 guys who play kind of similar to one another. Not a whole lot of size in that receiving core, but you have Travis Kelce, who is big. But I think you've surrounded Patrick Mahomes with so many good pieces. Your defense, yes, you lost L'Jarius Sneed, but you brought back Chris Jones. Trey McDuffie's arguably the best cornerback in the league. You have a stout defense, a stout offense. It's a good team. They're a 14 to 17 win team next year or close to it. Next up, the LA Chargers, and I'm also going to put them in that 7 to 8 win mark. Now, I've had a lot of back and forth about this Chargers team. A lot of fans think they're going to be a playoff team. I completely disagree. I think this is a building season for this franchise to build up the offensive line, to build up the receiving core, to surround Justin Herbert with better talent. I don't think it's going to all work in their favor in one year. I think they have some great tackles. I mean, you have Joe Alt and Rashawn Slater. Doesn't get a whole lot better than that. But this team has a lot of big-time issues, both offensively and defensively. Still kind of figure out that defensive line, but I think that Justin Herbert is good enough to get this team to 7 to 8 wins. I like Jim Harbaugh. I think that offense will be clicking and humming by the back end of the season, but I don't think it's going to be good enough to consistently beat some of the top teams in the AFC. Next up, we have the LA Rams, and I'm going to predict them to win exactly 11 games next year. They're going to be one of the best teams in the NFC. I think they're going to be uber competitive with the likes of the Seattle Seahawks and the San Francisco 49ers, those teams being, of course, their NFC West running mates. Are they going to win the division with San Francisco there? I don't think so, because San Francisco is just so loaded with talent. But LA, if they can stay healthy, which is a big a big caveat to this point I'm being made here. They have the pieces to compete with any of the teams in the NFC. Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, Kyren Williams, Blake Corum, a really good offensive line, a really solid defense. Some younger pieces defensively, but I do think that defensive line will work out regardless. I think the LA Rams have a lot of things going for them. We will see how that defense performs without Raheem Morris, but I still think that's going to be a really good team next year. Next up, we have the Las Vegas Raiders, and I'm going to predict them to win 7 or 8 games next year. I like the roster in general, and as you guys know, I am a Raiders fan, but I just don't know if I personally believe in Gardner Minshew like I do a lot of the other quarterbacks in the NFL. Like, I think that Gardner Minshew is a really good backup quarterback and a decent starting quarterback. But if you're asking a team to make the playoffs, especially in a loaded AFC, I don't think Gardner Minshew is the guy who can get you there. Still, with that being said, I think the roster is really good though. Next up, we have the Miami Dolphins, and I'm also going to put them in this 9-11 win mark. A lot of these teams that you guys are seeing in this upper half are teams that were really good last year. I think they're going to be, yet again, a good team next year. I think the Miami Dolphins are kind of similar to the Cowboys in the sense that I think that they're a good team. They'll probably win a lot of games in the regular season. They'll dominate the bad teams. But once they get into that postseason, can they win a playoff game? I don't quite think they will, honestly. Next up, Minnesota. I'm also going to have them in that 7 to 8 win mark. Whenever you have a young rookie quarterback, it's always going to be a development season for him. The roster is really good, but I do think with Sam Darnold or JJ McCarthy taking the helm, it's not quite good enough in the NFC. I think they'll be good, though. I think they'll be a solid team, a competitive team. But I think they're probably not going to go all in this year. They'll probably go all in 2025. Next up, the New England Patriots. They're going to be the one running mate with the Denver Broncos. I think they'll be a fun team to watch next year. A lot of interesting storylines going down there in New England. Obviously, Drake May being the biggest one. When is he going to play? I don't think he's going to play a whole lot this year. So with that being said, I'm not a big believer in Bailey Zappi or Jacoby Brissett. Obviously, they were one of the worst teams in the NFL last year. I think they'll be one of the worst teams in the NFL this year. I think that they will probably end up with a top 5 pick next year. Next up, we have the New Orleans Saints, and I'm going to put them in that 7 to 8 win mark. I think they're going to be a good and competitive team, but kind of similar to a lot of the teams in that 7 to 8 win mark. I have a ton of question marks about their roster, and I don't really believe in their quarterback and head coach. So I think they're good enough to be average, but I don't think they're good enough to be particularly great next year. So with that being said, 7 to 8 wins, I think that's a pretty respectable mark. Next up, the New York Giants. I'm going to have them in that 4 to 6 win category. I think that they have some good things going for them. I actually like their receiving core. It's actually pretty underrated, I would say, but I don't think it's like top 10, but it's pretty underrated. I think the offensive line is improving, but I still have a big question mark with Evan Neal. I like some of the pieces defensively, but I have some secondary concerns. It's a weird roster right now, and whenever you have Daniel Jones and Brian Daboll, it's really hard to predict how you're going to perform. We obviously saw how good they were in 2022, but then we saw it all crashing down last year. For now, 4 to 6 wins. New York Jets, they've been in a lot of headlines recently, but I still do believe in this roster. I think a lot of people are overreacting about the Aaron Rodgers being absent thing. I don't care too much, to be honest with you. They're still going to be a really good team next year. Next up, the Pittsburgh Steelers. I'm going to have them on the back end of the 9 and 11 win mark. I think they'll probably win about 10 games next year. They'll be a good team, but I just don't really know how I feel about Russell Wilson. I know last year they had a winning record against their own division mates. That probably will not happen next year. Could I be wrong? Yeah. Would I be mad? No. But I personally don't believe that Pittsburgh Steelers are quite up to the standard of a couple of the other AFC teams. They'll be in the wild card race, but will they make the wild card? I don't think so. They're going to have to beat the likes of the Colts, the Bills, the Browns, the Dolphins, the Bengals, some of the other teams to get to that mark, but I think they have a chance. Next up, we have the Seattle Seahawks, and I'm also going to be putting them in that 9 to 11 win mark. I know there's a lot of teams here, but there's a lot of really good teams in the NFL, and I do think the Seahawks are one of those teams. I think they'll probably win 9 or 10 games next year, maybe make a push in the wild card. NFL is so loaded with so many good teams, though, that I don't really know where Seattle fits into that puzzle piece. A lot of these teams in this category, especially on the back end here, are teams that I just have a lot of question marks about where they fit in this whole NFL puzzle. Like, if you tell me that one of these teams here that I'm scrolling through win the championship next year, like, I wouldn't be shocked, but I kind of would be shocked. Next up, Tampa Bay. I think they're due for a bit of a regression this year from last year, but I still feel like they're one of the better teams in the NFC. I just don't know how it's going to go out there quite yet on the field. I'm just not yet a big believer in Baker Mayfield until I see him play under a new offensive coordinator, but maybe he can prove me wrong. Next up, Tennessee. I'm going to have them also in the 7 to 8 win mark. I actually like the Tennessee Titans roster, but just don't believe in Brian Callahan all that much, and I'm still intrigued by Will Levis, but I just want to wait and see if he can actually perform that perform like that when it matters most at a consistent level. Next up, Washington, they basically revamped the entire roster for the most part, and I like the fact they did that, but I still have a lot of question marks about how that's going to look like in the NFL level. We'll see if Jayden Daniels can carry this team to a good record though. So as you guys can see, this is our finer tier list. You guys let me know in the comment section below which teams I got wrong, and if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button. But I love you guys. Peace.